I don't know if it is more insulting to men or to women to suggest that the solution to male loneliness is a pair of silicon tits that can't speak back. I mean, it's so awful for everybody. 1 in 8 of the videos shown to first-time users of the most easily accessible mainstream porn sites show women being raped or coerced or otherwise illegal acts. So it's not as simple as it sounds. Yeah, there will of course be adults who are using these things in what you might call a quote-unquote responsible way, but there will also be men like Wayne Couzens who aren't. And I think that's an incredibly high price to expect women to pay for those other men's sexual satisfaction. If you look at the metaverse, for example, where we're seeing that argument made repeatedly, women are being virtually groped or raped or harassed. Doesn't matter, go and touch some grass, take off your headset. You can't say that if you also want us to start living our lives in this world that you're pumping $10 billion a year into creating. These platforms are not going to mark their own homework. They are not going to protect women and girls and marginalised groups online unless they're forced to. Men's dicks trump women's rights, time after time.
Laura Bates, hello. Welcome back to PoliticsJOE. How are you?
I'm good, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. So excited, so glad that you are back. For people that didn't catch your last interview or somehow don't know who you are, how would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us who you are.
I'm a feminist activist. I'm also a journalist and an author. I run a project called the Everyday Sexism Project that takes people's experiences of gender inequality and tries to use them to create real-world change. And
the author of the new Age of Sexism.
Yes.
The title's on the back, but it's actually quite convenient because it means I can hold it up like this, right? This proof version. The new Age of Sexism, How the AI Revolution is Reinventing Misogyny, published yesterday in all good booksellers and probably the bad ones as well. Tell us about the book. What's it about?
It's about this moment of unique challenge, opportunity and peril. We are standing on the edge of a precipice where our world is about to be transformed in ways that we cannot yet fully imagine by AI and other emerging technologies. And it's about trying to get people, instead of thinking about the future dystopian risks, of robots wiping out humanity, to think instead about the ways in which those technologies run a very real risk of encoding yesterday's hatred into the foundations of tomorrow's world, the ways in which women and girls and marginalised groups are already being impacted by discriminatory AI without people probably even noticing or realising it's happening, and what we can do about it now to prevent a catastrophe.
Is that sort of a product of the biases, the prejudices of the people that are creating these systems, these machines? Are there other aspects that play into it, or are we talking about, to be reductive and simplify this, AI X is created by a sexist man, and therefore his prejudices, his biases are incorporated into said artificial intelligence program?
It varies. It's a complex picture. So, of course, the technology, AI in itself, isn't inherently problematic or misogynistic. It's reflecting the biases of the world that we live in. It also has the capacity to do brilliant things. This isn't anti-tech. It's not about saying we should step away from AI, we shouldn't research, we shouldn't develop, we shouldn't make progress. It is about looking at how we do that and who's doing it. So yes, there are some cases where overtly sexist programs and tools are being created by men deliberately. There are cases where tools which have inadvertent impact are being created by teams of overwhelmingly, for example, white men. And there are also situations in which, no matter what the intent of its creators, because of the ways in which some AI tools work, which is by ingesting vast amounts of existing data, the problem is that they are replicating existing forms of bias and discrimination and inequality inherent in the problematic data that's being used to train them. So it's a varied picture.
Misogyny from all angles. Look, we'll talk about the themes of the book and some of the issues that we've just touched on there. I'd like to start with an anecdote, if we can, that really sort of stopped me in my tracks. And can you just tell us, well, I was going to say who, but what is probably a better word. Is it Kokeshi? Is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, could you tell me what that is?
Yeah, so it is a sex doll that I visited at the cyber brothel in Berlin. It isn't new to have kind of sex doll and sex robot brothels that you can visit around the world as establishments, but this one bills itself as the first that uses elements of technology, hence the name cyber brothel. essentially with the aim of bringing the experience further to life. So, for example, one of the options is to use a VR headset and VR technology to animate and bring to life the experience so it feels and seems and is portrayed in every way to look as if you are interacting with a real woman, a moving, reacting, speaking woman, while you are in fact engaging with an inanimate sex doll or robot.
And some of I search for the right language to use here without sounding sort of like really quite horrific and affronting. But there's like a menu, right? And you can kind of specify how you want the robot to be when you arrive. Yeah,
I mean, there is a very, I would say, clear theme of misogyny in terms of the way in which they are portrayed. They're deliberately portrayed as hypersexualized, often racialized in particularly racist ways. In this particular establishment, there is one purportedly under a kind of vampire fetish, but essentially that you can have, who is covered in blood. I asked for one to be prepared with ripped and torn clothing just to see if there would be any pushback on that. No questions were asked. And it's really important to say that, this isn't about prudishness. It's not about being anti-sex. There are sex robots being designed that have rape settings, frigid settings that you can switch on so that you can explicitly rape them. They aren't being marketed as masturbation aids. They're being marketed as women. They're being increasingly, the lines are deliberately being blurred to create the sense that this is a woman you can own, but you can do anything that you want to her. You can customize her down to the last detail, freckles, skin tone, face shape. You can also send in a photograph of any woman in the world and have a sex robot made exactly to those specifications to look like her, down to nipple size, down to the shade of exact eye color, without necessarily having consent, which has massive implications, even just for women who are victims of stalkers, for example, for ex-partners of men. I mean, the list goes on and on. So there is extreme misogyny kind of encoded into the basis of much of this technology.
I mean, you know in the book how some of the owners make the argument that this in some way might be helpful towards women or other sex workers that essentially... and correct me if I've got their logic wrong, but if you sort of create an outlet for men to enact these violent fantasies, that then they're not enacting them on women in the real world.
That's right. And of course, what this relies on is the outdated trope that sexual violence is inherently a masculine attribute that is just in all men. And all that we can do is try and teach women to protect themselves and keep themselves safe. The privileging of the idea of male entitlement to sexual violence over women's safety. And you can see that absurdity if you imagine this logic being applied to any other kind of crime, right? Let's present these lifelike spurting robots for men who have urges to kill, to go and stab. And that'll be great because that'll totally protect society. I mean, obviously it's ridiculous. There's an element to which it condones and normalizes the idea that those are understandable desires that poor men need an outlet for. It's incredibly insulting to the vast majority of men. But there is also zero evidence to tell us that this in any way protects or prevents such crimes from escalating. In fact, what we do know about sexually violent crimes is that they do usually escalate. You only have to look at Wayne Couzens, for example, who raped and murdered Sarah Everard, who had previously 3 times been reported for indecent exposure, who had a predilection for violent pornography. In my work, I work closely with girls in schools, and I see every day the ways in which these things seep out into the treatment of women and girls offline. So sexually violent pornography, for example, where for a long time the same argument has been used. This is just wish fulfillment, it's fantasy, it won't have any impact. The number of girls I now meet who are aged 12 or 13 who are suddenly and unexpectedly being choked during their first sexual encounters, or perhaps in their later teens. These are huge problems amongst very young children. And we know that this is coming from online pornography and the normalization of sexual violence in online pornography. So, we're also seeing the National Police Chiefs Council suggesting that in cases of child sexual abuse, similar robots that sadly exist and similar material that is AI generated only risks the offences escalating offline.
We can talk about porn in a minute maybe, but the other sort of maybe end of the spectrum, or rather than being like, oh, there are these violent offenders and this provides them with a healthy outlet instead of actually hurting real world people, is that the other end of the sort of justification axis, if you like, is, oh, this could be a solution to the male loneliness crisis. And I found that quite affronting, just on a sort of, oh, do you know what the answer is to male loneliness? It's sort of like having sex with robots. It's like, what sort of chapter of late stage capitalism are we now in? Where it's like, you don't actually need human connection because we have this sort of, AI enabled robotic facsimile of the thing. So, don't worry about forming actual meaning, lasting connection with another human being. It's overrated.
You'll be fine.
Yeah.
It's hard to know even where to begin with that logic. I don't know if it is more insulting to men or to women to suggest that the solution to male loneliness is a pair of silicon tits that can't speak back. I mean, it's so awful for everybody, but also it's so inherent in the products these companies are promoting that marketing speak is absolute nonsense. I mean, we can see very clearly, for example, that they often will talk about loneliness and older men and perhaps men who might have lost their partners, widowers. And then you look at the fact that there are 0 60-year-old sex dolls. This is not about that. It's about serving up a dehumanized woman on a plate who you can own and do whatever you want to, and then going to extreme lengths to make her seem as real as possible. So when you visit the cyber brothel, the doll or the robot that you're going to visit will send you messages in advance about how excited she is to meet you, about she's so wet, she can't wait for you to arrive. So everything is deliberately aimed towards the blurring of those boundaries. They're encouraging men. Other sex robot manufacturers portray their wares as a superior version of women. She won't nag, she won't talk back, she'll never have a headache or say no. It's recycling these outdated, regressive kind of tropes of nagging, annoying women. And here's a better alternative. You can customize her, you can name her, you can determine her personality. She has self-warming, self-lubricating vagina. She has everything the same as a real woman, except that pesky detail of consent and the ability to say no.
And I guess also perhaps I was going to say it's a more modern trope, but I don't think it is, that it connects to this idea that sort of a man's right to sexual encounters with a woman, right? It's like the underlying logic of a lot of this is, regardless of a man's behavior, you have a right to sex. So, as you were just saying there, it's inconvenient, isn't it, that your potential romantic partner doesn't feel like she wants to have sex with you today. Yeah. And you can just bypass it because actually you're entitled to this thing.
Exactly. And of course, in that sense, it overlaps very closely with incel ideology and other forms of extreme misogyny that we are just beginning to grapple with in our society and talk about trying to tackle at the same moment that billions of dollars are being pumped into technologies to make that more possible, more normalized, more widely available.
I saw Elon Musk, when he got interviewed by Rishi Sunak, they did like a fireside chat, I think it was a couple of years ago now. And Elon was talking in quite glowing terms about, how an AI could become your best friend. Mm-hmm. And if you were lonely, you could essentially, have an imaginary friend probably isn't the right way to describe it, but you could have someone that you could talk to in your phone, right? And whilst not the majority of people, certainly in the UK, don't have access to these types of brothels, they do have access to forms of AI that essentially are sort of companions and they can talk to, right? And I wonder if one of the real world, again, I'm still searching for the language to describe this because these things are real, right? It's not it's not like happening off in the ether, but if, let's say you've never been in a romantic relationship with someone and your only experience is messaging an AI character, it seems quite clear to me that that's going to lead to a sort of de-skilling of young lads who would possibly should be looking to socially interact with romantic partners. That actually it could almost become this kind of feedback loop where they spiral because they can no longer actually interact with the people in the real world that they would like to form a relationship with.
Absolutely. So in exactly the same way that we see on incel forums, for example, young men who struggle socially being taught to believe that the world is inherently programmed against them, women are inherently evil and misogynistic, which ironically then goes on to compound exactly the kinds of misogyny and issues that are probably at the root of their communication issues in the first place. It's the same thing that we're seeing here. The idea that this somehow helps lonely men by encouraging them and supporting them to work on their relationship and communication skills, of course, does exactly the opposite, because what it presents is a hypersexualized, always available, vulnerable, submissive, amenable, pliable woman who is available to them 24/7. She's never going to disagree with them. She's never going to challenge them. She's never going to have a difference of opinion or a bad day or need a couple of hours to herself. And in that sense, it is training men to think of women in a completely unrealistic way and to have that, again, expectation of a really high level of entitlement to women's bodies, to women's minds. If you think of sex robots as giving men the opportunity to own a woman's body, to do whatever they want with, AI companions really are giving them the opportunity to own her mind.
Fuck.
And they're really widespread, right? So this is what I think is really important about this. People love to talk about sex robots because they see it as salacious and titillating. It gets a load of airtime.
I started the interview with it.
No shade. But it is really important to recognize that AI companions are 1,000,000 times more popular, more widely used, and yet far fewer people have ever heard of them. In the last year alone, just looking at the Google Android Play Store, these apps, just the top 11 of these apps were downloaded 100 million times. That's before you even look at Apple. This is absolutely massive. It's completely widespread. There are entire communities of men on the internet dedicated to abusing these AI girlfriends and showing each other the most depraved ways that they can abuse them physically, sexually, sharing it with each other. It is really worrying that we're not even so much as talking about this. And when we are, people are talking about these great companion apps that are, harmless and available to help people learn how to chat. That's not what they're selling.
We had Dr. Fiona Gray on here a couple of years ago, and we were talking about online pornography. And when I was sort of trying to present the sort of the challenge or the devil's advocate, whatever you want to call it, to her, I kept sort of, and afterwards I realized this, I kept sort of falling back to this idea that consumers of pornography or, consenting, responsible consumers of pornography should be able to distinguish between fantasy and reality. Mm-hmm. And should we not, when we're talking about adults, people who are compos mentis, that at the end of the day, they should know or should be able to draw the line between this isn't a real person. This is a tool, a piece of technology. If I was to make that argument to you now and say, well, all these guys who are just, talking to these robots or bits of software is actually probably a better way of describing it, in these most sort of depraved, base, vulgar ways. Yeah. Is it not just a fantasy for them? Like how would you respond to that challenge?
There's a whole number of arguments to make here. The first, I think, is the ready availability of these apps, of these forms of technology to children, to people who aren't adults making that decision and who are going to have enormous impact. We know, for example, that over a quarter of children are 12 or younger when they first come across online porn. And Dr. Vera Gray's incredible work has found that 1 in 8 of the videos shown to first-time users of the most easily accessible mainstream porn sites show women being raped or coerced or otherwise illegal acts. So it's not as simple as it sounds, because actually that's not necessarily the way the technology does work, or it isn't necessarily safeguarded and ring-fenced and packaged in that way. We know that it is accessed by young people. We know that it portrays violence. And then, there will of course be adults who are using these things in what you might call a quote unquote responsible way, but there will also be men like Wayne Couzens who aren't. There will also be men who are abusers, where it will normalise and embolden them. And I think that's an incredibly high price to expect women to pay for those other men's sexual satisfaction in a world in which we know that 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten in her lifetime. When I was researching this book, the thing I just came back to again and again was that men's dicks trump women's rights, time after time.
So if we talk about another place that AI intersects with, I guess, sex and specifically pornography. Yeah. And that's deepfakes. Yeah. And whilst, I think possibly a lot of viewers will be familiar with kind of political misinformation, and there was a clip that went around last year of a manipulated, not real clip of Sadiq Khan talking about Armistice Day, and obviously that, you don't have to be a genius to figure out the political application of something like that. But that would probably give you the wrong comprehension of typically how this technology is leveraged and used, which is that the overwhelming weight of it is to create pornographic content and 99% of that pornographic content is a manipulation of a woman. It's a creation of a fake video that involves a certain woman. Now, women have the same level of access to this technology as men do. So do homosexual men, but it is the overwhelming weight of it is being women are the subject of it. Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's actually not true that women have the same access to this technology, because most of it doesn't work on images of men. Most of the apps that you download will only work on images of women.
Right.
But you're absolutely right. A lot of people, if they've heard about this in the mainstream press, will have heard about the potential risk of deepfake technology to democracy and the idea of spreading misinformation among voters, because that's where the focus of law enforcement and criminal justice in the mainstream media tends to be. In fact, there was a Europol report released specifically about deepfake technology and its risks and how to police it. It was 22 pages long, and it mentioned the word women once. And there were 2 short paragraphs on deepfake pornography. But exactly as you say, 96% of all deepfakes are pornography. 99% of those affect women, feature women. So what we're seeing here is really new technology giving whole new ways to enable what is, of course, very outdated forms of misogyny. I had a man send me a deepfake clip that he created of me that was incredibly realistic, that showed himself forcing his erect penis into my mouth and using it to choke me as I cried. That's not about sex. This isn't about saying all men shouldn't be allowed access to these tools that are about sex. It's about power. It's about control. It's a form of abuse. It had a pretty dramatic effect on me, and I'm someone that can receive 2,000 rape threats on a single day, so I'm pretty inured to this stuff. So just imagine the impact it has on the 11 and 12-year-old girls I am meeting, not now and then in isolated spots, but repeatedly at schools who are experiencing this. I'm meeting girls who are only 11 or 12 years old who are feeling unable to leave the house. They're dropping out of school because these incredibly realistic pornographic images of them are being shared by the boys at their school. They're being shared around their local communities. They're terrified that they might be seen by their parents, that they might get uploaded to porn websites, that they might never be able to control them or take them down. I mean, just imagine that as a 12-year-old child. The impact is devastating. And yet we're still thinking about very important but kind of dystopian potential future political threats.
I mean, do you mind if we talk a little bit about, I guess, take the conversation for a minute, and I do want to come back to deepfakes. There's more to talk about there, away from the thematic, and talk about you on a personal level.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, as you described that deepfake that you received, I physically recoiled. And there must be moments when you're doing work like this, whether it's in the research phase, whether it's coming out, and I assume probably actually when you're in the public eye a little bit more is probably when the density of it increases. You've surely thought, going, this isn't worth the stress it's placing on me. Or, I mean, if I just invite you, perhaps rather than putting words in your mouth, to talk about how it makes you feel.
I mean, it's horrible. It makes you feel sick. It has a really real physical impact to see that someone has been able to take your face and your likeness and do that to you. And there's a powerlessness about it, that there's nothing you can do about it. You can't stop them from masturbating to it. Sometimes people will print it out, masturbate on it, and send me a picture back of it covered with their semen. Like, the level of it is, I think, more than people perhaps realise when there's this tendency to go, oh, women talking on about online abuse again, no, don't make a fuss. Because what these technologies are doing are enabling those forms of abuse to feel more and more and more real. And it does have an effect. But the more I research and the more I'm uncovering and experiencing, the more I have a feeling of a sense of urgency that I have to do something about it. I don't think anyone could hear the number of stories that I hear on a day-to-day basis from women and girls facing often far more traumatic and devastating things than I face, and not feel compelled to want to do them justice and to support them and to speak out for them. You know, those girls at school don't have a voice. They're not able to come and talk about it like I am. And so there is a sense in which you just really, really, really want to be a voice for them.
Is there as a professional and someone who's striving to be as objective and rigorous as possible in the work that you're doing, if you're experiencing it firsthand and suffering the kind of emotional trauma of experiencing it firsthand, how have you been able to I guess, maybe not rationalize, but how do you think about trying to doing the impossible task of removing yourself and your personal experiences from the thing that you're so directly trying to analyze and produce, solid bits of work about?
I mean, it's a difficult one. It's a difficult one partly because you are required to talk about your own experience of it in order to get people to listen and to care. And that's partly understandable because people relate more to human stories than they do to statistics. I understand that. But it's also because the media would like to present you often as a victim rather than an expert. And that's something that uniquely women in this field are contending with. Not all firefighters are putting out fires in their own backyards. Not all oncologists are at the same time battling cancer. But uniquely in the frontline sexual violence field, women so often are setting up the services they themselves desperately needed when there was no one there to support them. Women are so often themselves battling forms of abuse that they are experiencing as a result of speaking out against that abuse. And I think it's really difficult because we do need those stories, but we also need to make sure that we're presenting solid bases of research that will force people to listen and take us seriously. What I've learned is that I have to arm myself with statistics because if I don't, then nobody will believe me. Partly because it sounds so extreme and partly because people don't care about misogyny. It's normalized. So if I talk about my own experience, there will inevitably be people who want to say, OK, you've been unlucky, stop banging on about it. But we know that by the end of this year, we're on course to see 8 million new deepfake images created. We know that over the last year, there's been a 2,000% increase in social media referrals to these sites. We know that over 30 female UK politicians have been directly impacted by this form of abuse and that the website hosting the porn clips of those female politicians had 12.3 million viewers in a single month. There's your threat to democracy. Why aren't we talking about that as a political crisis?
Okay, let's talk about it. So it's convenient we have these microphones and cameras pointed at us. Yeah. Okay, so in the case of abuse or any of these problems, to be honest with you, deep-seated and real, the response you will see, and people have said it to me before, when you talk about abuse or anything like that, they'll say, well, fucking log off the computer, pal. Yeah. Touch grass.
Yeah.
You can make it go away. It's not real. And actually, one of the owners of one of the biggest deepfake porn sites sort of essentially says this to you, right? He makes the argument. It's like, it's not real, so why does it matter? Mm-hmm. I mean, very clearly it does, right? Okay, because it's happening on a screen doesn't mean that my emotional response to something is invalid or insignificant or not real, right? Is that it sounds so obvious when I say it out loud like that, but when that individual makes that argument to you, how do you respond to it?
As a society, we don't struggle with this in other areas except when it affects and pertains to women, right? Yeah. Like when we watch a horror movie and we're really scared and our heart rate rises and our hands shake
it's
and
not
we
real. What
jump
are you doing?
out of our skin.
Grow up.
We know it's not real, but it still affects us in our bodies and no one contends with that or has a problem with that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, billions of dollars are being pumped into making this world the future. If you look at the metaverse, for example, where we're seeing that argument made repeatedly, women are being virtually groped or raped or harassed. It doesn't matter. Go and touch some grass. Take off your headset. You can't say that if you also want us to start living our lives in this world that you're pumping $10 billion a year into creating. If you want us all at some future point in the not too distant future, they hope, to be sitting in virtual classrooms and lecture theatres, to be having virtual board meetings, to be shopping in virtual shops and going to see virtual events. I think we need to start trying to shift our perception of tech regulation and harms in line with the way in which we're completely fine with holding other corporations accountable. If a multinational food conglomerate said, billions of people will consume our products each year, a few of them are going to die of salmonella. You can't expect us to get to grips with something, which is basically what tech companies are saying. This is too big, it's too difficult. When they have those tens of billions of dollars in budget, then they're not going to be able to build a world where we're prepared to let people enter those classrooms, where we're prepared to let people step into those shops. While I was writing the book, the new Co-op arena in Manchester was being built and they kept delaying the opening because it hadn't yet met the rigorous safety requirements to allow people in there. And I know people will hear this and, that's totally something that we would expect and understand. High-profile singers had to cancel their tours. And what people will say is, okay, but there aren't real-world harms inherent argument here. But there's two things about that. The first is that the haptic technology is developing at such pace. You can already buy full body haptic suits where if you step into the metaverse, everything feels real. So very quickly, there will be much less of a line between what a virtual and a real world sexual assault seems like. But secondly, if you want to talk about a lack of real world harm, you've got to grapple with the fact that at present, the NSPCC says that 47% of child grooming offences online are taking place on Meta-owned products. And we know that those offences escalate to real world harm.
So you touched on regulation. I want to come back to it.
Yeah.
But just on that, and particularly you've spoken already very eloquently about how pervasive particularly deepfake technology is for school-age children and in schools. And I think the thing that's quite affronting, concerning for me is the knowledge gap, particularly for the responsible adults, be they teachers, be they whoever they are, that a lot of them don't even know what a deepfake is. And I kind of would draw a parallel perhaps to for a recent sort of cultural phenomenon is there were people who were sort of saying adolescence was their kind of jumping off point for misogynistic content and extremist misogyny and its radicalization of young guys online. Or we should show it in schools, etc. And I was banging my head against the table, to be honest with you, being like, I would hope that we don't need to show this in schools because all it really serves is like a jumping off point for having this conversation.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, how do we address that? Is it showing adolescents in school? No. Is it? But if, in relation to deepfakes specifically, what's the education piece? Is it training of teachers? What do you see as a potential mechanism for us to kind of try and address that?
Well, it is of course part of a much broader set of harms. Many of them technologically facilitated, but not all of them. All of them with misogyny at their root that we know are causing a crisis of sexual violence in schools. This will be the next big epidemic of sexual violence to hit schools. It is already hitting schools, but just as you said, we don't really know about it. We're not really recognising it. But it isn't something in isolation. It's part of a wider issue that we can see in the fact that a BBC Freedom of Information request recently found that on average 1 rape per day of the school term is being reported to police from UK schools. So this is a wider crisis and this is one part of it. And what we need is not, of course, just showing a TV show in schools. It is absolutely comprehensive whole school approach to this problem. It needs to be not just about sex and relationships education, although that's vital and needs to start from primary school and be high quality and age appropriate. But it's also about everything from school dress codes to the curriculum, to the way in which the playground is laid out and being used, to how schools tackle and take seriously sexual harassment and violence. And schools can't do that on their own. I know there'll be teachers listening to this who are trying so hard already. If they're female teachers, 72% of them will themselves be experiencing misogyny in the classroom. They need support, they need resources, they need training, and they need funding to get this right.
You mentioned Meta in a previous answer, and if we could delve into that a little deeper, actually, you mentioned sexual assault. Sexual assault has taken place in the metaverse already, Horizon Worlds. One of their large language models was used to create child sex bots, and there are deepfake websites / apps that are present on Meta platforms. You also have listed some of the other statistics, right? It feels like there's a weight of evidence there that. The question I was going to ask you is, does Mark Zuckerberg care about women's safety online? But it feels rhetorical to be honest with you when you line up the evidence in the way that you already have done. I don't know how else to ask it. What do you say in light of that information? I mean, can these companies claim they make a lot of them, whether it's in relation to beyond misogynistic ones about the safety of teenagers online, about political interference alleged or otherwise, should we trust them? Should we when they say they're trying to address these things, do you find that credible?
I think we should judge them by their actions, not their words. If we look at the metaverse, the CCDH did a study recently. They found that every 7 minutes, on average, a user was exposed to an abusive incident or abusive behaviour in the metaverse. And they tried to report the 111 or so incidents that they logged using Meta's own reporting platform. They found that only half of them could even be reported because of the way in which the forms are set out, that you have to fit them into an existing category. Half of the abuse didn't even fit into those categories, but they duly reported the other half of it. Not only was no action taken on a single incident, but they didn't even get a single response. Meta has had a dry run to show us how it deals with harassment and abuse and endemic racism and misogyny with the world of social media, and we need to learn a lesson from what we've seen there. These platforms are not going to mark their own homework. They are not going to protect women and girls and marginalised groups online unless they're forced to. Social media actually can be thought of as a kind of microcosm for this whole issue that we're talking about. Voices were raised early on, particularly the voices of Black women who always sound the early alarms about these issues, about bias on the platform, about abuse, about it not being a safe space. Their voices weren't listened to. What we are in now is a situation where those platforms are now so foundationally entwined in many of our lives in terms of our careers and our work, the ways in which we get our news, the ways in which politics is conducted and so on, that it is now almost impossible to walk back the fact that the price of existing on social media for women in marginalised communities is an unacceptably high level of abuse, a constant stream of doxing, abuse and threats. We've failed there, but it's not too late to learn a lesson from that, to stop and say, before we allow AI products to be released to the public, before we throw open the doors of the metaverse and encourage thousands more people to go into it, we need to have certain pretty simple safety requirements for creating spaces that users can be comfortable in. It's not too high a bar.
I guess the argument in relation to the regulation conversation, right, goes, whether pick your tech bro, whether it's Zuckerberg, Elon, Bezos, the way their technology kind of, it's almost like Pandora's box, right, where it's so massive and far-reaching that the myriad problems, and it could be in relation to kind of, extractive rents in the case of Amazon, or as we've been talking about here, extreme misogyny, that it's sort of like Pandora's box, right? The company's created, they become these behemoths, and they develop in these ways to improve their margins, to drive shareholder value, and quite often they're not even cognizant of the problems at the lower end of the platform. Mm-hmm. So if I then go, okay, well, how can a government try and regulate these platforms? And you're thinking, well, if the CEOs and the owners and the chairman and whoever aren't even possibly cognizant or willfully ignorant about these problems, how on earth can we expect, DCMS in the UK or, Lena Khan at the FTC in America, how on earth can they try and broach these problems? It feels like almost insurmountable, to be honest with you.
Well, yes, but I think good regulation forces them into a position where they can no longer afford to ignore these problems. They're not unaware of these problems because they're too difficult to become aware of, because it's impossible to gather this data. They're choosing not to. They've got an income bigger than the size of some small companies. They could pour billions of dollars into this if they chose to, but they will have to be made to, because they are never going to do it by choice. And actually, if you think about, again, I would lean on this idea of kind of a multinational food company. You wouldn't make the same argument there. It's still massive. It's still sprawling. You're still dealing with a huge, huge network and infrastructure and factories and supply chains and shops. But it wouldn't be acceptable if there was a massive outbreak of salmonella. It would be shut down, no matter what the cost. We have legislated for other complex, fast-moving things. We do have regulation for things that are transnational. We legislate for issues like fraud, which are similarly very, very fast evolving. And actually, the legislation in that case is deliberately designed to take that into account. This is difficult, but it's not impossible. We can look at past examples of, for example, the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention, a gold standard framework that can be adopted in different territories, that can be ratified and used around the world. The reason why we're not doing that is not because it's too difficult. That's what the tech companies would love us to believe. The reason we're not doing that is because there is no political will. The reason there's no political will is because of who's standing in the Oval Office. And sadly, the UK government seems to be being very heavily affected by that. When they were talking about putting the Online Safety Act on the table and being prepared to water down its provisions if that would help them to secure a favourable trade deal with the US, you should ask why those two things were ever on the same negotiating table. And again, the answer is who is standing behind the other negotiating table next to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I find just to sort of drop into politics briefly, the whole spiel, whether it's from Trump or whether it's from Conor McGregor actually is one of the more high profile ones recently, talking about sort of, threats posed to the American people or to the Irish people and how dangerous it is. And you're sort of going there, well, you've both been found liable for sexual assault in both of your cases. In Conor McGregor's case, your victim, her tampon had to be removed surgically because of the assault she was subjected to. And you want to stand in front of a lectern and tell me about who poses a threat to the Irish people, right? Is it immigrants? Is it these foreign invaders, as you would call them? Or perhaps maybe we should be looking a little bit closer to home, and maybe you would do well to look into the mirror and think about the threat that you possibly pose to the Irish people. And the way that these kind of misogynist abusers it doesn't seem to be a barrier to entry to power. And I could call it naivety, I guess, but you sort of hope or want, maybe is the better word to describe it, that there's a world where there is no political reward for being that type of character, and yet incredibly depressingly it seems like there is.
Well, that's it. It's not just that it's not a barrier to entry, it's the opposite. It's a benefit. And again, tech is inherently involved here. We know from Christopher Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, that Steve Bannon actively courted the votes of incels as an important voting bloc for Donald Trump. These whistles, dog whistles that these politicians are quite deliberately sending out to certain communities are bringing them benefit in the form of votes, in the form of voter support. And we need to grapple with that and the reality of that and what that means. But it's absolutely the case that unless our governments develop some kind of confidence and some kind of a moral compass in being prepared to stand up to these men, they're not going to stop. They are ruthless in their pursuit of profit. Zuckerberg might have officially changed his motto, move fast and break things, but the reality remains exactly the same. This is perceived by these companies as a kind of playground, this AI gold rush that we're seeing. It's like a new space race, and it is very much about a playground for billionaires amassing extreme, obscene wealth, absolutely at the cost of the human beings whose trauma and abuse they are literally using as a building material.
Yeah, was it Google's was "Don't be evil," right? In the beginning,
they quietly dropped that as well.
Yeah. Just finally, and we'll recenter on AI.
Sure.
You said you're not anti-development, you're not anti-growth, right? But what you do suggest, and I'd ask you to sort of close with, is this changing of definition about what progress looks like in the space. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is progress for who and progress at what cost? In our rush to fall over ourselves to become the world leaders in AI, I think there is a risk that we are forgetting the incredibly high price that some communities are paying and the ways in which this is too important to leave to those very few white male billionaires, because actually it has the potential to do brilliant, transformative, positive things for humanity. Already AI is being used to track deforestation. It's being used for brilliant healthcare breakthroughs. The potential is there. But what matters is that it's designed in such a way that when those products are released to the public, when they're having a public direct impact, there are bespoke safety standards at that point that they have to meet. It doesn't mean that they have to have those standards during research and development stage necessarily, but we certainly should be disentangling big tech interference and funding from that research and development stage. The problem is that even when, for example, at the AI summit in Paris, many countries signed a pretty tame declaration saying that AI should be ethical and should have safeguards built in at design stage, the US government and the UK government refused to sign it. So even at that most basic level of saying progress should be for everybody, something incredibly simple, things should be safe before we use them, there seems to be this reticence and reluctance. And of course, if we look at the people who are developing those brilliant, exciting, positive AI products, we have a massive issue in the fact that only 12% of AI researchers are women, 80% of AI professors are men. And when companies are trying to get funded, there is 6 times more venture capital funding being spent on male-led AI teams than on those led by women. So it's a David and Goliath battle in every sense.
Laura Bates, it has been a genuine privilege getting to speak to you. Thank you so much for coming in. The book's impressive. You're impressive. It's out now. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.